September 5th and Karaptis Remetьево. The airports and oil refineries in St. Petersburg and Moscow are on fire. Thousands of drones over Moscow. Even someone as scary as Solovyov hasn't seen anything like this. A collapse is starting in Moscow.
Cars are burning everywhere.
Damn, this is fucking chaos.
3 days and nights without a break. We're bombing Moscow.
Drone chases are exciting.
Muscovites are in a panic. They're running out of their homes.
Even my third one caught fire.
In the airports of Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's been a collapse for 3 days straight. The aviation system is destroyed. 1,000 flights have been cancelled. Almost 2,000 have been delayed. 90,000 Russians are trapped.
It's just brutal. Everyone's flights are cancelled. Everything's cancelled.
In St. Petersburg, they're jamming mobile signals. The airports are like camps. People are sleeping on the floor, crying, shouting, fighting for information. This
plane landed yesterday evening. I've been trying to communicate normally for a whole day,
but I can't manage to keep it together.
If there will be an end to the end at all or not, it doesn't work.
Fine.
The airport is not talking. Not!
The airport doesn't work.
Massive crowds, widespread panic, utter hysteria, absolutely no flights, no communication connection, and ultimately no hope. Scandals begin. And there is a fiery hell in Rostov. The warehouse is on fire. The explosions come one after another. The fire covered almost 10,000 square meters. Yekaterinburg is shrouded in smoke. The country is drowning in fear. And at the top, the elite are being purged. Generals are dying. Deputies are suddenly disappearing. No one knows who will be next. It's going to be heated on air. Breaking news, friends. On September 5th, a series of powerful explosions is shaking Russia. Oil refineries are burning in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
What's going on there?
And in Isu, they're bombing Pita. And Moscow.
And in Freenet, cars are burning.
In Ryazan, drones struck an oil refinery. A massive fire broke out. Meanwhile, in the temporarily occupied Luhansk region, drones hit an oil depot. In Crimea, Flamingo missiles hit FSB facilities. Everything is on fire. Cars are burning. Houses. Moscow is in chaos. For the first time, Moscow apartments have been destroyed thanks to Russian electronic warfare. This is already quite a panic. Clinics.
Yours shot them down over us.
I filmed it.
Russian electronic warfare is targeting the apartments of elderly Muscovites. A military base is burning in Rostov-on-Don. Hundreds of dead Russian soldiers. The fire can be seen from a kilometer away. In Domodedovo, Sheremetьеvo, and Pulkovo, the carpet plan is in effect again. It's an aviation collapse there. Hundreds of flights are delayed or cancelled. At train stations, people are sleeping under kiosks. Panic. Evacuation. People are dancing the Katyusha at the airports. Nearly 1,000 flights have been cancelled. The Russians are in a panic. They're fighting, arguing, and calling the police. People are stuck at the airport for days without connection, internet, food, or hotels. This plane landed yesterday evening.
I've been trying all day.
To communicate normally. Imagine what will happen to us in the end. It's not working out.
Normally,
Can't talk about flights. The airport isn't letting anyone go. No.
airport, no one. It's not working out.
We can't exchange tickets for any information. I've lost my tickets from Istanbul to Venice. 3 tickets. Now, for each ticket, they're asking me for $980. What a shame, really. It's the same thing here. So what's going on? This is Russia for you. It's a boomerang effect in retribution. And at the naval base, Russian boats have been destroyed. Russia is burning. Putin is in a panic. The speeches didn't reach their target. The occupiers and Russians got scared. Here's your boomerang.
And 3 times over for you?
Hit it, damn it, please!
Damn!
Muscovites are weeping.
Damn it all to hell!
Let's discuss all of this right now with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan.
Damn, the cars are really burning.
Breaking news, friends! A series of powerful explosions is shaking Russia. Oil refineries are burning in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as in other regions. In Ryazan, drones struck an oil refinery, sparking a fire. In the temporarily occupied Luhansk, drones hit an oil depot, causing a powerful detonation. And in occupied Crimea, Flamingo missiles struck FSB facilities. And at the naval base, the occupiers' boats were destroyed. Russia is burning. Putin is in a panic. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Wishing them good health.
Let's start with the oil industry, because at the beginning of September, the armed forces of Ukraine disabled almost a quarter of Russia's oil refining capacity. Russia is losing fuel and its economy is on the verge of collapse. What does this mean now for the front and for the Kremlin?
The most important thing is that these strikes have continued. There was a pause here for about 3 or 4 days, maybe even longer. There were no strikes during that time, but now they've resumed again. Credit should be given here to Medziar, Major Brody, the commander of the drone systems forces. They accomplished their combat mission. After that, the destruction of the Russian oil industry began. This is very important for us. Why target the Russian oil and gas sector? A quarter to a third of the budget comes from it each year. Russians received more than $100 billion in foreign currency over the course of a year. And then they redistribute it, including, of course, to the army and to support those republics within the Russian Federation that are dependent on the budget. That's why it's so important for us to destroy this mechanism, the influx of petrodollars into the Russian economy. And what will this lead to in turn? The collapse of the Russian Empire? If the dependent republics stop receiving money, they will break away. Where will they end up, as they say? Well, naturally, this will lead to the destruction of the state itself, the destruction of the army, and the disbandment of the army as well. The army is a derivative of the state. No, the state isn't there. That's precisely why what Major Brody's Advanced Unmanned Systems Forces are currently doing right now is actually one of the crucial milestones, one of the essential mechanisms of our ultimate victory. In other words, these actions, especially if they continue with the same intensity as at least in August, and now September has already started with new strikes on the Russian oil industry. If this continues until the end of the year, then next year, Nabiullina will have to turn on the printing press, and the year might be covered by even more printed money. But that's just 1 year, no more. By the end of next year, we will see the complete collapse of the Russian economy. Then the processes of degradation and the disintegration of the Russian Federation will not just accelerate, which will ultimately lead to our victory. That's why one of the mechanisms leading to victory is precisely Brody's work on the Russian oil sector.
Roman Igorevich, according to the commander of the drone systems service, Madyar, in August, Ukraine disabled another quarter of the oil refining capacity, 17 attacks on refineries in just 1 month in August alone. Can we say that if we continue this in September, today is September 5th, then in principle, Moscow risks being left without a strategic fuel reserve? That's the question.
It's unlikely that Moscow itself will be left without fuel. Russia will be left without fuel. The Russian army will be left without fuel. They will drag the last of the fuel to Moscow. The very last place they'll take fuel from will naturally be Moscow. In order to leave Moscow without fuel, we would need to strike the Ryazan oil refinery. What's most interesting is that over the past 24 hours, strikes have been carried out on the Ryazan refinery. They are depriving Moscow, including of diesel, because in addition to the oil pipeline, there's also a product pipeline there which was used to pump diesel. There was a strike on that product pipeline, and now there's a direct strike on the Ryazan refinery itself. Plus, Kapotnya supplies Moscow. That's the Kapotnya oil refinery. And there's an oil refining plant in Kapotnya that provides at least half of the needs of Moscow and the Moscow region. The other half, roughly speaking, that comes from the Moser refinery, but the Moser oil refinery is connected to the Druzhba oil pipeline. And if that pipeline is finally taken out completely, Moser will simply shut down. There will be nothing left to roughly produce gasoline with, meaning they won't be able to do any refining. So there are ways to leave Moscow, at least for a certain period, without fuel until they start taking fuel from the army. And that's definitely going to happen. They'll leave the army without fuel, but that fuel will be redirected to Moscow. In other words, they'll be pulling it in for Moscow. So when there's no fuel left in Moscow, that's when we'll see Muscovites not in Ferraris and Maybachs, but riding donkeys and little donkeys. That's when they'll really feel what it's like, for example, for the army to have to move with the help of a donkey, or rather like little donkeys.
Roman Igorovich, the Flamingo missile strikes on Crimea. Everyone is already writing about it. In Crimea, Flamingo missiles hit FSB facilities and military infrastructure in Armyansk. Satellite images show destruction and craters from the strikes. How painful of a signal is this for the Kremlin that Ukrainian missiles are now reaching deep into the peninsula and will continue to advance? That's the question.
Here, the question is about the Flamingoli. Why? Because after all the strikes, at least the craters we see in the video footage and photos that are now appearing could be from either 500 kilogram or even ton-sized munitions. That is, there is a dependence on the soil, a dependence on the angle of entry, a dependence on the delay time of the detonator. That is, there are many such moments related to the fact that it is 100% difficult to say that it is a ton of barrels. There are 500 kilograms of the peninsula at least, although one can say that at least more than the peninsula went in there. What was that? Flamingo. Or it could be a ballistic missile, not ruling out that possibility, because by now at this point they really should finally, on the 7th attempt in this pointless direction, show at least something, at least some kind of ballistic missile, at least some kind of missile with a large warhead. It could be, once again, it could be Grom, it could be Flamingo. In your Groms, the warhead is about half a ton, while the Flamingo is claimed to have over a ton, so this is exactly that situation. Well, it doesn't really matter in principle what exactly was used. Until we have confirmation, as experts, we won't comment on it specifically. We'll at least provide some classification regarding its use. But the point is that now, at least new warheads are being used. Very large ones, meaning large calibers, are hitting Russian positions in our Crimea. And in general, the strikes are very precise. Why did one strike hit exactly where the Russian FSB agents were located, and the second one landed nearby? Most likely, it was for so-called fine-tuning, or maybe the first one landed nearby to scare them a bit, make them hide in the building, and then they hit the building itself. It depends on how you want to interpret it.
Roman Nikolaevich, we've noticed that we're striking intensively at air defense and missile defense systems, as well as radar stations in occupied Crimea. Please give your assessment of this.
As we've discussed, any air operation begins with achieving air superiority, which mainly starts with ground strikes on the enemy's radar stations and radio technical troops. So what we're seeing now is that for the second month already, probably the 5th week of these strikes since August, there's been an intensification. The Main Intelligence Directorate is doing an excellent job, acting precisely and specifically, taking on combat missions, preparing and striking a large number of radar stations and missile defense complexes, according to the Security Service of Ukraine. They have shown excellent results. Within just a couple of weeks, they took out more than a dozen Russian radar stations, which allowed long-range drones from the same unmanned systems forces of the Ministry of Defense to carry out combat missions almost unhindered, directly targeting military facilities in Crimea itself and, in fact, all the way to Anapa. There were also strikes there, including on radar stations, even in Anapa and near Novorossiysk. So this is movement in that direction. I think in the near future, we'll be discussing this more. We'll keep talking about it. This is exactly what we talked about with you before. In the near future, there will be some kind of attack, specifically an air or missile strike, whether it's aerial or ballistic, doesn't really matter. The main thing is to first suppress enemy air defenses and then carry out the combat mission, not ruling out the possibility of direct involvement of aviation in these raids on Russian military targets in Crimea. Why? Because if Russian air defenses are seriously suppressed or thinned out, which is exactly what our forces are doing now before the airstrike, then after that, naturally, aviation can directly, using unguided aerial bombs, enter Crimea and start bombing military targets there. There are still more than 150 stationary military facilities left from the Soviet era in Crimea. We know perfectly well where they are located. We used them ourselves at one time, so to put it this way, the locations of Russian military units at these sites will not be a surprise to us. Let's wait, because on the one hand, their capabilities last somewhere from another 3 to 4 weeks at most, but realistically, of course, it's about 1.5 to 2 weeks. That is, the Russians still manage within 1.5 to 2 weeks to replace, or at least bring up equipment to replace a destroyed radar from the IRK. So from 1.5 to 2 up to 3 to 4 weeks, depending on their capabilities.
Roman Igorevich, they're also writing that, in addition, it's confirmed that Russian hovercraft have been damaged at the base. At least 4 units of the fleet have been put out of commission. Is this an isolated incident, or is it the beginning of a systematic destruction of the enemy's naval forces? Roman Igorevich.
The so-called Mosquito Fleet, the naval forces, I wouldn't really call them significant naval forces. Of course, they are part of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation, but the main fleet has pulled back to Novorossiysk. That is, the ships of the main Black Sea Fleet are now closer to the Novorossiysk area. They're hanging around there, and you still need various means to reach them. But as for the area around Crimea, for example, or even the western part of Crimea along the Black Sea coast, including the currently occupied Skadovsk area, the Russians mainly use the so-called Mosquito Fleet, various types of boats, small missile boats. By the way, our GUR guys managed to damage 1 MRK, well done, hovercraft, regular boats, and even rubber boats with motors, which are called Karnson and Upipa. So this Mosquito Fleet is, in principle, vulnerable to strikes, and lately we've seen a significant increase in the use of Bayraktar drones. Why have Bayraktars started operating in this direction? Because the Russian fleet can operate from the sea, but since it has been pushed back, the air defense systems located on the ships can no longer affect the Bayraktars, and the Bayraktars are effectively striking this so-called Russian Mosquito Fleet. In other words, these are boats, not ships. Seriously, they are just boats. But nevertheless, if there are a lot of them, if their numbers reach a dozen or more, it's a significant blow to the Russian naval infantry and to the capabilities of the so-called Russian Mosquito Fleet to operate along the coast. Again, this could be preparation for such actions, that is, the elimination of the so-called Russian Mosquito Fleet base. This could be preparation for a certain naval or our own naval aviation operation, including a comprehensive approach because we're seeing strikes on radars and on mechanisms for movement at sea. Ideally, this could be preparation for serious operations, first an air operation, then a naval one, and possibly even a ground operation. I wouldn't rule out that possibility. In fact, from their perspective and speaking for ourselves, the most optimal scenario, for example, if crossing the Dnipro is set as a strategic objective, would be to advance towards Skadovsk, that is to reach Skadovsk, cutting off the Kinburn Spit and the Tendrivska Spit. So with that advance, basically from Skadovsk to Crimea, it's only about 50 kilometers by sea. In fact, you could almost get there on a water bike, and our special forces or Marines could pedal so fast that they'd reach Crimea at the speed of a jet airliner.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, what's happening in occupied Luhansk? Last night there were explosions at the oil depot. It detonated and burned quite spectacularly.
The Luhansk oil depot is basically the main fuel hub for Russian offensive operations on the Eastern Front, specifically in the Donetsk direction. In Donetsk, we can reach the Donetsk oil depots. We've damaged several of them there in the past, and the Russians, for the most part, don't transfer large amounts of fuel there, just enough for transshipment and quick delivery, say, to the front line. But the real military hub, the big fuel hub, is the Luhansk oil depot. We've hit it several times as well, although the Russians generally restore it very quickly and try to cover the oil depot with air defense. In fact, there shouldn't have been any fuel there if we hadn't stopped striking the oil refinery in March of this year. So, stopping the strikes on the refinery in March allowed the Russians to practically fill this oil depot to the brim with diesel and gasoline. So right now it's completely full. Naturally, there's a certain amount of fuel being used up. So the second wave of the Russian offensive has already begun. They're already starting to draw fuel from there. It was just a matter of time before we reached it. There had been several attempts on Luhansk before this, but the enemy's air defense managed to cope. That is, they destroyed most of our drones, they couldn't get through. But after the strikes over the past couple of weeks, after the strikes on Russian radars in that direction, it turned out a certain gap was created in their air defense. The density of their air defense decreased. Naturally, our drones and possibly even missiles were able to operate in the direction of Luhansk. That is, missiles could also have entered there, which carried out the combat mission of destroying that oil depot. Now the eastern direction is practically left without fuel. Without an operational reserve, so to speak. Of course, now they'll start hauling barrels by train directly to Yasinovataya, but in Donetsk we'll be waiting for them, meaning they'll be unloading mostly in the Donetsk area or around Yasinovataya, and that's already within range of HIMARS. I think in the near future we'll be discussing with you how well the railway tank cars burn in Yasinovataya.
Roman Grigorievich, the manufacturer Flamingo has announced new FP7 and FP9 missiles with a range of up to 855 kilometers and speeds exceeding 2,000 meters per second. If such systems are put into service, how much will that change the situation on the battlefield?
Sorry for the pun, but these office announcers have been consistently announcing all sorts of missiles and drones for the second year in a row. What on earth haven't they announced yet? It's quite remarkable, really. Like I said, green, office announcers, that should be their name going forward. Where are the missiles? What good are those announcements to us? We're already fed up to the brim with these announcements, these videos. Something is flying somewhere, some launches, some serial production. Where is the missile aimed at Moscow? So the first ballistic missile to hit Moscow, or even the Flamingo, which, according to the specs announced by those announcers, could theoretically reach there. That's why, aside from calling them that, I have nothing else to say. There's not even any point in analyzing all these announcements. Why? Let me explain. Well, because an analyst analyzes real actions.
Right?
So at this point, what we need is not a military analyst or a military observer, but say some kind of film critic. Or, I mean, what kind of critic is needed here? Basically, some critic from that movie crowd. So you should be asking them, how do you like this kind of teaser? And what about this one? How do you feel about how these shots were edited together? And what about the girl who came out and lit the fuse before the rocket launch? How did she appear? From what angle? Well, I'm not an expert in this area. So this is a question for a film critic. But when there is real work happening in the Russian rear, that's when we'll analyze it together. So a big hello to those teaser makers. Let them keep making teasers for themselves.
Ukraine and the Philippines are preparing an agreement on cooperation in the field of drone production.
There is a military component here. So for now, this isn't an announcement of anything. So this is an attempt, for example, to establish relationships with those countries that in principle could be useful to us. Why would they be useful? First of all, with joint production, no matter what kind of weaponry, two objectives are achieved. External financing, which is very important for us, that's one. And second, the commercial aspect. Why? Because the weapons produced will be in demand on the markets of those countries, at the very least, that will enter into these commercial relationships with us after our victory. So you could say now, at least from a military and economic, or rather a military economic perspective, here I already understand a few things, so I can analyze this. This is a very good step. That is to expand, for example, even to the Philippines. But yes, this is very important for us. This is a new market, and moreover, it's a very large market. So this direction, Indonesia, the same goes for the Philippines, all the way up to almost Australia. This whole group is very important for us. It's a very large arms market at the moment, and if we can enter it, especially with joint production, that would be great. Moreover, besides being a large arms market, there are quite a few significant economic groups there that can finance both the development and production, and then, of course, the purchase of such weapons. So there are no questions here. This is definitely a good move.
Roman Grigorievich, can we say, for example, that the alliance between Ukraine and the Philippines on drones is already a global recognition of Ukrainian expertise? And can we say that today we are becoming a world leader in drone technologies? That's the question.
Well, for now, the global leader is still China. But we need to understand, yes, so where can we actually be first right now? We can be the first, and we are actually becoming the first in the use of drone technologies on the battlefield. And sometimes for certain specific countries that genuinely want to establish, say, robust economic relations and strong partnerships with us, this particular aspect is profoundly important. So it's not just solely about producing advanced drones, but also about comprehensively understanding how to effectively use them and, so to speak, actively participating in perhaps the strategic development of comprehensive military doctrine, or at the very least being deeply involved in the intricate strategies for employing the various types of weaponry that we are currently utilizing on the dynamic battlefield. By the way, this is practically not just economic intelligence. You could say this is already military intelligence. So most likely intelligence agencies are involved in all these processes, probably including our own. There's no way around it. Well, naturally, the same goes for the Philippines. Why not? If, for example, intelligence agencies start interacting with each other and continue to counter certain challenges regarding sovereignty and territorial integrity, that's very important. That's why, in this sense, the economic, military, and geopolitical aspects are all very significant. So it's a good move.
Roman Grigorievich, the coalition of the willing has agreed on the option of deploying 30,000 European soldiers to Ukraine. And now the UK and France are already on board. Germany is hesitant, and the US is only providing intelligence and air cover. In your opinion, is this real protection or just another political facade without any real authority?
There's a saying, or rather an expression, like a poultice for a corpse. Why is a poultice useless for a corpse? Because he's already dead, right? And this coalition of the willing with a few thousand soldiers and escorts and so on and so forth. After your capitulation, we'll send them to you. But why would a corpse need a poultice in the end? Because after our capitulation, they tie it to the cessation of hostilities, to the refusal to reclaim occupied territories by military means. In other words, to the abandonment of military struggle, which is tantamount to capitulation. What is capitulation? And in general, why does one army try to force another to capitulate? And how does this actually happen? The army that tries to force the other army to surrender or capitulate brings it to a state where the opposing army gives up armed struggle. The whole point of capitulation is the refusal to continue armed struggle. The entire army might still be intact, still combat ready, but if that army refuses to fight, that means it has capitulated. What is currently being pushed into Ukraine's information space is being promoted by certain ethnic groups. I would say talking heads from a particular country, they are pushing for Ukraine's capitulation at this stage. If you follow the information flow, you'll immediately be able to determine which country these talking heads belong to. So all of them are specifically pushing for Ukraine's capitulation. After this capitulation, all the European power, wow, amazing, will be like a poultice on a corpse. That's about how it is. After capitulation, we won't need those remedies, not after we've already died as a state, after we've lost our sovereignty over the occupied territory. What does it mean to give up armed resistance? Let me explain now. It means the loss of sovereignty over the occupied territories. Where am I wrong here? Because this is, in its purest form, capitulation. Moreover, calls for the loss of sovereignty are criminally punishable here. That is Article 1 and 10 of the Criminal Code. Read the Criminal Code. Frankly, I would like to hope that all these talking heads, besides having passports from other countries, also have a Ukrainian passport so they can be prosecuted under Article 110 of the Criminal Code. We don't need these remedies. They definitely won't help us after our death, that's for sure, and that death won't happen. No one is going to capitulate. No one will give up armed resistance. And that's for those comrades who are pushing this narrative, suitcase, train station, and off to places of compact settlement.
I read this news from military journalist Andriy Tsaplienko. Strategic aviation emergency. The Russians are in a panic. One of the Tu-160 aircraft, which was planned for a terrorist attack on Ukraine, was unable to take off from the Engels airbase, and another Tu-160 also failed to launch. What's going on, Roman Grigorievich? Are these isolated incidents, or is this already a real problem?
Well, it was attacked by lightning. In other words, it was attacked by the Heavenly Office. Seriously, the strike was quite significant. How many times have we said, our believers who pray of different denominations, here I'm an agnostic, I treat all faiths the same, absolutely the same, at least as long as they are not aggressive towards other faiths. So we have many people praying for our victory, praying for the punishment of the aggressor. Naturally, in the end, all these prayers converge in the Heavenly Office, and God is one no matter what he is called. Well, God is one. And of course, the return of these prayers, the so-called boomerang, comes back, including to those mechanisms that, well, against which our believers at least are praying. By the way, a big thank you to them for that. Everyone understands perfectly well that prayers in the end, especially in large numbers, manifest themselves in the material world as well. These kinds of lightning strikes on those massive beasts like the Tu-160, for example. No matter how you try to discharge them, there are certain discharge devices on the wing sections, but no matter how you try to discharge them, these are still high-speed, large surface machines, so naturally a large amount of static electricity accumulates and then lightning strikes the object. Naturally, with a guiding finger, a finger from the heavenly ring pointing exactly where. So one aircraft was neutralized and the second one couldn't or wasn't able to launch its missiles. So most likely the drums got jammed there. The Tu-160 has 2 drums, each holding 6 missiles. So the missile release mechanism broke, and the third aircraft didn't take off at all. It had its own problems. But what is the Tu-160? Like the Tu-95, it was produced back in the day during the Soviet Union, and quite a large number of these planes were made. They were pretty good planes. By the way, they were based here with us, and we gave them away. Well, not us personally, they were given away by those rulers who for such actions should be dug up, shot, and buried again. Along with the Tu-95 and Tu-160, we also gave away our nuclear weapons. So now these aircraft, well, they're just starting to break down. They're not like Trump. If they were like Trump, if they were called not the White Swan, say Tu-160, but Trump, they could have lasted until 80 years old. But here it turns out they're falling apart even earlier. This really is a collapse. They can't restore them. They'll end up at Aurora, meaning they'll be scrapped. And in Kazan, There are still a few old Soviet Tu-160 airframes standing around. Of course, they'll reassemble them, send them back into the air, and they'll fall apart again. The Russians do not have a full production cycle for strategic bombers. In the next few years, or maybe in about 15 years, it simply won't be able to take off anymore because its so-called airframe life will run out. That is, every single component, every unit has its own so-called flight resource or service life. For example, let's say an engine has flown several thousand hours. That's it. It's decommissioned without any repairs. So in the end, all these planes will end up on display pedestals somewhere, pretty much the same way it once happened with the MiG-17, MiG-19, MiG-21, including some of the Ushkas, and the Tuchkas will end up there as well.
Roman Grigorievich, to sum up, the Russian armed forces have carried out the largest regrouping of their troops since the battles near Kyiv in 2022. With a large number of forces, they are ready for the final and decisive battle for the remaining part of the Donetsk region, according to OSINT analysts. They warn that soon we will once again see the use of armored vehicle columns. The floor is yours.
Well, if today is laundry day and the 5th ward is being swapped for the 6th, then it's not exactly a change of laundry, as they call it. That's pretty much the same thing happening with the Russians at the moment. No questions about the second wave. Reserves have arrived, equipment has arrived, and as for the rotation of some Russian positions, it's mostly about redeployments, mainly the redeployment of the 155th and 810th Marine Brigades, who are being tossed around like manure in an ice hole. First they were sent to the Kursk direction, then to the Kherson direction, and now they're being redeployed to the Pokrovsky direction. Like I said, they're being tossed around like manure in an ice hole, back and forth. So this is basically like changing the sheets between hospital wards, the 5th swaps with the 6th, something like that. In other words, the total number of Russians being used in offensive operations hasn't increased. What has increased are the reserves, which are supposedly intended for an operational breakthrough if these naval comrades, the Marines, manage to break through somewhere, or at least attempt to organize an operational breakthrough somewhere. Then, for example, columns of equipment that the Russians have now brought up would rush in there already facing little to no combat resistance, the so-called second wave. If this does not happen, and most likely it won't, the one place where the Russians can and are now trying to break through our operational rear areas is the Pokrovsk area, moving toward Dobropilya. So this direction is currently the most dangerous for us. It is precisely there that a large number of Russians are now gathering. There are already more than 100,000 gathered there, and equipment has also been brought in, but they will only use the large amount of equipment will only be used after a breakthrough. That is, when they can move into open operational space, where they won't be targeted by the drones of the Magyar unmanned systems forces. For now, at this moment, they will try to use motorized infantry units with just a little bit of equipment, maybe 5, 7, 10, 12 vehicles at most, no more than that, to try to push through some of our positions. The unmanned systems forces are currently handling this very well. Magyar is indeed creating a serious kill zone there. The only thing is, of course, we need to help by increasing troop density to boost our troop presence on the Eastern Front. This can only be done by removing armored vehicles from the security forces and deploying them within our law enforcement system. At least 100,000, maybe we could reassign up to 500,000 law enforcement officers to reinforce the Eastern Front. There is such a possibility, and if it is done, we will hold out. We will grind down the second wave using long-range strike capabilities, FPV drones, and various other means, and nothing terrible will happen.
Friends, please like this video. Leave a few kind words in the comments to support our tandem, to support the armed forces of Ukraine. Roman Hrihorovic and I regularly work on my YouTube channel, Daria Shaslivaya, so that you know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. The well-known military analyst Roman Hrihorovic, thank you. And as usual, see you this Monday.
Goodbye.